friends, welcome back to part 2 of our Women of Wisdom series. Together at the table, we're talking about marriage. I wanted to point you to part 1 of this marriage discussion, which is posted on my webpage, leahsims.org, or on my author Facebook page at Facebook. Encourage you to jump out there, catch that discussion. We had a good probably hour and 20 minutes diving in on expectations that we come into marriage with, how marriage shifts and changes and evolves as children come into our lives, both our natural born kids and blended families. And then we talked a little bit about conflict, how to resolve it, what it looks like, some really practical tips on what to do to make sure that we are always moving back to the loving place when we have those moments or seasons of conflict in our lives. But we're going to jump in part 2 right now and discuss a couple of harder topics. I'm not going to pause to introduce all of my friends here because they introduced themselves on video 1. So I'd encourage you to go back and start with part 1 and work your way through this with us. But they're all the same ladies that were on the first video. And so we're just going to jump in the interest of time and not to be repetitive. Jump right into the discussion. So we're actually going to jump right off the diving board here, right out of the gate, and talk about sex. We could not have a discussion about marriage. We certainly couldn't have a discussion about what relationship with our spouses at God's table should be, what it looks like, what a healthy relationship looks like, if we just left the concept and topic of sex and intimacy off the table. I always tell people that when they ask how important is it, or how important to your marriage, or how much a part of a marriage should it be, and my answer is always, when it's really good, it's a small part, but when it's really bad, it becomes a very big part of your relationship, whatever it is defined at. And we're going to talk about what intimacy is. It's not all about sex or sexual intercourse. It's about intimacy. It's about migrating away from maybe preconceived notions of what romance in a relationship looks like, to true regard and to true intimacy. And then we're going to talk about how important is it, and why do we need to put it in its proper frame and perspective within marriage, and what happens when we're not paying enough attention to it in a relationship. So I want to start with Brandy and ask you to jump in here with me. Why do you think sex is important to a marriage, first of all? So like, what's the real reason beyond procreation? Because we could all say that. How important is it to a marriage? How do you differentiate between sex and intimacy? Because they're not necessarily the same thing. And intimacy sometimes is really the important thing that we're after, especially women. And what are the warning signs in that area that you've experienced that tell you, I need to pay more attention to this? This is a neglected or wounded area of my relationship. So thank you for kicking us off with such a tough subject.
Yeah. Sure. Someone's got to go first, right? So we, in our house, sex we take a different conversation. Jason and I started again, pre-Jesus. I was out of the flock, out of the will of the Lord. And he was not a believer at all. So our relationship was solely based on sex when it first began. I mean, that's really kind of where it came down to. We were two very attracted people, and it was an easy relationship to jump into. And as I became more and more convicted, and the Lord drew me closer and closer back into a place of intimacy with him, I found that my intimacy with Jason began to really struggle for a number of reasons. Before we were married, it was guilt and shame. And I also came to the table with baggage. As a sexual abuse survivor, I had that, and I came to the table with that and all these things that I had to work through. But over the course of our marriage, it has shifted and it has changed. And we've had to overcome the reality that one of us has not always been faithful to the other. In times of difficulty, we've had to kind of face that. Like you put in our last session talking about conflict toe to toe, and really having those tough conversations about the why and what got there and what led to that. And then as we overcame that difficulty, we found ourselves in a unique situation where I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis and have started to really face a lot of really debilitating pain and issues with mobility. And our sex life has changed dramatically because of that. And where it used to be, frisky and wild and uninhibited and untimed. Now it's very intentional. And I think, especially over the last couple of years, we have come to a point where we've had to kind of come face to face with some difficult things, and recognizing when it's a big deal for me, when it's not a big deal for me, when it is for him, when it's not. And I think the biggest struggle we've had, honestly, is that his number one love language, anybody want to guess, is touch. It's like it is physical touch. And it is not mine. It never has been mine, that it's the very bottom. And I've had to learn over time with him, and he's had to learn over time with me, that the biggest source of intimacy for us is having a conversation about intimacy. I think those times when we've really struggled have been those times when we've just stopped talking about it and avoiding it like it's this big elephant in the room, whether it's because I was hurting and he didn't want to put pressure on me, or because there had been someone else in our sacred space. Yeah. And one of us had to learn to forgive and face that and find our value again in that level of intimacy. I think it's critical, no matter what phase you're in, no matter what stage in your marriage you're in, it is critical that intimacy be the center of conversation. And then you're right, it's not always about intercourse. It's not always about that sexual activity. And for us, just to be very candid and upfront with you, what used to be great, bedroom time has now turned into conversations on the back patio, and really just owning the ugly and the hurt and the vulnerability. And I have found that I needed to have that space, and he's needed to have that space where we could both be just completely vulnerable with one another. Yeah. And sometimes I don't really know how to put this, but we're naked without being naked, if that makes sense. Yeah. Where we literally just lay it all aside and say, okay, it's not that I don't love you. It is not that I don't find you attractive. It's not that I desire anyone else at all. In fact, I think you're the most attractive thing in the world, but my body is not responding. And for him to be able to say, to me, honestly, I get it here. I don't always feel it here. And this is what I need this is what you can help me. And for me to truly listen and to not be defensive, because we have had seasons where I've been very defensive about the fact that I can't always do what he needs me to do from a physical perspective. And I got very insecure very fast, to put it, for lack of better terms. I put up this wall of, if I can't perform in this way, then it must not be worth anything to you. And that was my assumption. Yeah. My insecurities, the enemy whispering in my ear and me grabbing hold of it, and learning to trust that, he's just as comfortable being intimate with me. And when we can, it's great. Yeah. But the bigger thing for us, making sure that those special moments are everything that God designed them to be, enjoyable and trusting and intimate and precious and empowering in all of those ways. Everything it has to lead up to that. The conversations, the vulnerability, the being naked without being naked, all of those things have to matter. And for us, that's been the bigger conversation. I asked him when we were talking about this, because I was sort of nervous. And I shared with Leah, I was like, this is not really our strong suit in a traditional stance. But he, I was like, what makes you feel intimate with me? And he was like, the fact that you would even ask me that question, knowing that you trust me enough to give you an answer that is loving and loyal. And that's huge. That's a huge component for us when it comes to intimacy and sex.
I appreciate you sharing.
I love your husband.
Me too.
It's a number, like, you have a chronic illness, and it reshaped the conversation for you. And I don't care, you and I were talking about it, whether it's how we feel right after we've had babies,
yes.
Most of your pregnancy can be, for some people, that's a great time of intimacy. For other people, it isn't. And pregnancy can be really hard. Those, weeks and months after you've given birth or had a C-section, there's a break in maybe what your normal physical intimacy routine would be. And you have to figure that space out, because that can feel like neglect to somebody real quick if you're not tending to it. But it's also, we talked about menopause, surgery, aging, there's this conversation about intimacy has to be flexible and adaptable, because it's going to change the course of marriage. There are going to be seasons where, intimacy has to mean something else than just, physical intercourse. And there's a lot of times when even when intercourse is probably on schedule and working, but there's still a lack of intimacy in your relationship.
Yeah.
You can be having great sex and still have a lack of intimacy in a relationship. So that's an important thing too. So thank you so much for, just having the courage to share that the definition and picture of that for you guys is maybe different or non-traditional, or maybe it's more normal than we think. A lot of people are probably going through that, but that's the value of this conversation, is understanding that it is, that it's a much broader things than how many times you're doing it every week, because sometimes husbands are like, that's how they'll define that. How often are we doing it, versus, versus the quality of it. And also, is intimacy present in other areas in your relationship, not sexually? Are you able to have intimate conversations? Are you able to be naked without being naked in terms of your feelings and those kind of things? So that's beautiful, Brandy. Thank you so much for sharing. Danielle, how would you answer that question? Because that's been an up and down for you too, just based on, and we're going to get to that in a little while, trials in your marriage have probably changed the way you look at that and had to redefine it in new ways.
Yes. So, very similar. I grew up in a very broken home. Sex was not really a shared topic or a topic of discussion in a healthy standpoint. And so when I got married, I didn't know what that was supposed to look like. I wasn't really sure. And so as we were sitting here, just thinking and processing, the thought came to my mind that sex is the act, but intimacy is the attitude. It's the behavior. And so, for like Matt and I, he's going to be real happy when he hears this part. Sex has always been really easy for us. It's just something that we naturally were able to come into with each other. My husband's got it. I'll just leave it there. And, just a little brag. There you go, Danielle. Okay. I opened the inappropriateness up just for you. Okay. And so, but intimacy was the place that we lacked often. And I would say the reason why we lacked that place often was because in seasons of our marriage, he couldn't fully represent himself and I couldn't fully represent myself. Intimacy is what Brandy was saying. It's about being completely vulnerable and being naked in all spaces and places with the person that you love.
Yes.
And there's a lot of seasons, especially in seasons when you're going through trial or physical pain or whatever that looks like, where you're guarded and you're trying to self-protect. And so you're really not naked and unashamed anymore. In the beginning in Genesis, we see that man and woman were created and they were naked and unashamed. And through life and through circumstances and situations, we can put those clothes on, the clothes that Adam and Eve also put back on in front of God. We can do the same thing in our marriage, and we can block the true intimacy, not just in sex, in all areas, like we were saying, but especially in sex. I think because I'm a practical person, so I think one practical thing we did to get that intimacy back, and Leah, I think you gave me this advice, was we read Songs of Solomon together. Songs of Solomon is such an intimate, romantic book, y'all. Oh my Lord. And so before we would have sex, I know this sounds so weird, is we would read a chapter together, and it would put the perspective of like, what does it mean to be naked and unashamed and love each other's bodies and love our own bodies, in front of each other and be secure in that. And also one other huge thing that we had to learn to do was be a safe place for the other person to fully represent who they are. There's times when Matt's not perfect and he's struggling and he's going through what he's going through. And there's times when I'm not perfect and I'm struggling and I'm going through what I'm going through. But instead of being a space of judgment for each other, we needed to be a space of safety. And within being a space of being safe for each other, it kept the naked and unashamed attitude in the midst of our marriage, which continues to translate. And I would just throw this book out really quick. This is like, Daniel, I know you and I have talked about this book before, but it's The Self-Centered Marriage, Rebuilding Our We by Reclaiming Our I. This book, y'all, mind blowing. But one of the chapters, which I jumped ahead to, was all about sex and intimacy and what does that look like? Because it is, like Leah was saying, we can't just not address it or talk about it. It is a center. It is a big component in a marriage, and it is very important. And this book has some really great insight to what that can look like. And so if this is an area that you're struggling in, another practical thing you can do is get this book, because in mine and which we'll talk about in a minute. My husband and I separated for a year. In that separation, this was a huge tool and resource and book that we used to help get us back to where we are now.
Amazing. Amazing. I can't wait for you to share more of that. Thank you, Danielle. That's I don't have that book. I need to get that. I love that whole concept of moving to the we and getting out of the you place. I think you called it in our last video, get out of the you place, because we didn't tend to do that. We're pointing the finger outward. So that's great. Danielle Bridges.
Yes.
Sex and intimacy to the
Yeah.
one who is still 24 years later calling her husband hot stuff all the
Yeah.
time. So what you have
Well,
to say about that?
I love what both of you said, really. I mean, I agree with you that like communication with each other, making sure you understand what each other likes and doesn't like, and having those intimate conversations, respecting each other. I love that the marriage bed is undefiled. I love that. And so that opens the door for lots of opportunities, as long as both of you are respecting each other and you are, on the same page and loving each other. I mean, the sky is the limit for the marriage bed. It's like having a warm fire in the fireplace versus, when a fire is out of control, when it's not in the fireplace. I think Stovall referenced that one time, and I just absolutely loved that reference. But just some small things that I think about is like making sure that he understands that intimacy for me in the actual act of sex is so mental, and that has to be a priority for him, because men, it is not very mental to them. It's so physical. I mean, it can be. I'm not saying that it's like absent of it, but I'm just saying doesn't take much to get them where they need to go. And if we're going to have fireworks, then he needs to make sure that there's preparation on my side, because my mind doesn't have a nothing box like his mind. My mind isn't going to go from this compartment to this compartment as quickly as him. So there's some things that I've had to express to him, that if you want the best of me and you want me to literally breathe you in and give you everything I've got, then there's some things that I need you to do for me. And one of those things is locking our door, making sure that it is locked. Because if I even have this much of my brain thinking that my children can come in my room, I mean, a large majority of my brain is going to be monitoring the sound of the hallway and the door. And so that's very important for me, as silly as that sounds. And just making sure that you are comfortable enough to say, I don't like that, or I do like that, or what can I do for you? What do you like? Also, I am not afraid to send him cute pictures of me during the day. And I've even had people say, like, are you scared somebody else will see them? Well, first of all, my husband is not showing anybody else his wife. But second of all, I'm not sending him ugly pictures of me anyway. So, I'm just kidding. But just, little fun things like that too. Just keeping it fun. Keep flirting with him, keep touching. And having said that too, also there's some nights that we don't actually have sex itself, but literally we are touching each other the entire night, like completely. And I don't even know how we do that and sleep, but whatever. But anyways, I just love how the two of you talked about how intimacy isn't always just the actual act of it, but yeah, so many things we could talk about this.
So that's slow roasting in our house. Danielle, slow roasting, that's what we call that.
Slow roasting.
Yeah, he starts in the morning, he goes, I just want you to know I'm slow roasting you. Like, that's his cue for like, we need to tonight. So all day long, he's like sending me cute little gifts and little hearts and He slow roasts his woman.
Oh, I like that. I want to be a crock pot too.
It's
Okay.
funny how often that works, and we had to sit down and have a conversation and about the fact that sex is sacred, and we both came from an environment where it wasn't. Like, we both grew up in a space and place where sex was not sacred, and I had to shift and change my behavior about how I saw my husband. And I think, Leah, you talked earlier about being a student of your significant other and really learning and understanding that as we grow and change, our needs and our wants grow and change. Mm-hmm. So you're right, Daniel, you got to say, like, what I liked when I was 20, maybe not so much now. Like, maybe my hips don't do that anymore. These hips lie. Y'all's might not, but mine do. So, and getting to the point where you can say to him, and there's a passage in Jeremiah where it's written, the prophet writes that if you seek me, you will find me if you seek me with all your heart.
Yes.
And I think we can apply that to marriage in a lot of different ways. When we talk about our spouses and we're talking about intimacy, if you are committed to seeking intimacy with me and your husband is committed to seeking that intimacy with you, you'll find it. You'll find it in the most creative ways, in places that you least expected. That veil will come down. And when it does, you're right, Danielle, all bets are off. Like, I am not afraid to try anything and to tell you what I like or dislike, or what's comfortable or not comfortable, or that I can't today because of this, or I really want to. So please, throw me a bubble bath on and play some music and we'll get, it's going to happen.
Yeah, or throw it on for yourself. Like, there was a season when Matt wasn't
yes, girl.
roasting, but like, I can slow roast myself. I can get myself pumped,
Yeah.
And so, there was a season when bubble baths, shaving my legs, telling myself I was cute, putting on romance.
Yes.
I had to do it myself, but you didn't necessarily always know to do that until we could get into the place of those conversations.
Yeah. Yes. And I love that you just said that, because part of the thing that like made our situation like even more amazing was me getting to a point where I was just so super comfortable with like learning myself, like literally taking the time to pay attention during the situation to say to myself, what is appealing to me? Like, what is my body responding to? And the more that I can be fulfilled in that situation, the more I am going to give him, the more I'm going to go all the way there with him. Because like I was saying earlier, it's so much easier for them than it is for us. And that's not all women. Let me just say, some women are there like that, and bless the man that has her, because he's a happy man. But anyway, yeah.
I think you've touched on something there that I want to make sure we land on. Like, why is it important? Why did God create sex? I mean, obviously, it's necessary outside of a test tube environment for us to have children. And so it could be very tempting for people to land on sort of this, archaic way of thinking that, well, sex is for children. But I believe very strongly that one of the reasons that God has us come together this way is for the protection of our marriages.
That's so good.
And that, God knew that we were going to need a special bond with our spouses, and that they were going to need it, and we were going to need it. And I can tell you, one of the words of advice I always try to give to young wives, having gone down this road a couple of times, is to not take it for granted. And when we had a conversation in the last video about when children come, one of the worst things that happen when babies come is that intimacy can unravel. And it can unravel for all the reasons that we said. Physically, we're tired. We've just literally built a human being in our bodies, and then we're expected to feed them and do all of this for them. And all of our physical attention, every fiber of our being, every instinct that we have shifts to mothering and away from courting and dating and all of the things that, kept that thing popping in the beginning. Like you said, Brandy, when you're first together, or Danielle, you're like, what are two people that are single and not Christians doing all the time, having a whole bunch of sex? And then all of a sudden you get married. And I remember my ex-husband saying, you get married because then you think that's when you're going to get all the sex, and that's when it stops, because the babies come and, all of that. But I can tell you, having gone down the road of not knowing how much having children was going to change my libido, was going to change my focus, that I can tell you that the demise of that marriage was tied very much to the neglect of our marriage bed, by both of us, but initially by me, because I'm like, I'm tired. I can't tell you how many times I said, I'm tired. And when I hear wives say, you know, I could take it or leave it. If I never had it again, I'd be fine. It's always a red flag to me. And not in situations like you're talking about, Brandy, where you have to redefine intimacy a different way. But when women just say, I don't need it. And it's a red flag to me. And I always want to talk to them and say, God created this to keep you and your husband right here with each other. It doesn't mean you have to do it all the time. You shouldn't let how many times you do it be defined by how the next person is doing it or how often they're doing it. But it is designed to protect you. And it is a warning flag for your marriage when you're not attending to it, and you're not attending to your husband's heart, and you're not attending to your husband's need, and vice versa. So I just want to throw that out there. We don't want to define what sex needs to look like for anybody. That's not our goal today. But I do think it's important that we kind of, you know, emphasize that it is an important part of marriage. However we might individually define it, it's important, and it's not to be neglected, which is why I said at the front end, when it's healthy, when you're paying attention to it, when both of you are talking about it, when you're defining intimacy, and you're not just defining it, but you're stepping into it and engaging in it together under whatever that definition is, and it's healthy, it fits in its proper space in the pie of things that are important in your marriage. It becomes one piece. But when it's neglected, when you're not on the same page about that at all, it becomes a really big thing. And it becomes sort of that elephant in the room that you're not talking about, and can become, just telling you from personal experience, you can wake up one day and go, how did we get here? How did we get to a place where we no longer, even in our emotions, feel intimate about each other, regardless of where we've been physically? And I think that's a challenge that we have to watch for, because just like with negative thinking about our spouses, if it's been a long time since we thought they were sexy, if it's been a really long time that they were attractive to us, if it's been a really long time that we looked at them and felt that little feeling, that's a warning flag, and we need to pay attention to it. Because not only have we left our marriages wide open for the enemy, unprotected, and I'm not saying infidelity is a justifiable outcome in those cases, but there are certainly many instances where that's where that inevitably ends up, because we didn't think that was as important to a marriage as it needs to be. So I'm just throwing that out there. Any comments on that before we move on to trials?
I was going to say something just really practical, and I seen this meme, and it was actually, I think, in the context of like going to work and having a job, but it said just a simple thing of changing your mindset to, instead of I have to, I get to.
Yep.
I get to have this. And that's like you were saying, one thing that only our spouse can give us. And just being grateful and thankful and cherishing that special thing. Cherishing your spouse and cherishing intimacy is huge.
Yep, it is. Thank you guys for being vulnerable and transparent around a subject that can be difficult to talk about, but so important. And I love hearing different perspectives. We don't all have the same, wouldn't define that the same, but I know that it's healthy, and it's thought about, and it's accounted for, and it's deemed to be something of importance and value in your relationships. And I believe that a lot of times that's the connective tissue that keeps those relationships really strong. So let's move on to trials, because, and I touched on one, infidelity. There's certainly places that our marriages can tend to go, either because of really differing expectations that aren't met, or brokenness and baggage that we carry into relationships, or a deteriorating intimacy that leads to unintentional wandering that then becomes infidelity. There's also issues with addiction, and so many things that find their way, either are brought into the marriage or find their way into the marriage, that bring us to a place that we don't necessarily stand at the altar on our wedding day and expect that our relationships are going to go. None of us stand at the altar and say those vows with all the starry eyes we have in our eyes in that moment for our husband, and ever think things could go terribly south. And yet they do. And there's ways that we come back from them. And then there's sometimes when walking away is sometimes the only option. So I want to make sure that we're attending to the hearts of women who watch this in both of those scenarios. Of course, you know, we could spend a lot of time talking about God's heart about marriage, and we will land there. But we want to put grace around the fact that this doesn't always work out the way that we hope it will, and certainly not what we think is going to happen when we step at the altar. So having said that, I want to start with Danielle and Melissa, because you guys recently, really within the last few years, have walked out really challenging areas of marriage, and your marriages were on the brink of divorce. I think it's safe to say for both of you. I mean, you guys, you're like, I can't, I'm done. And you trusted God to intervene, and we all do that in every relationship. And in these particular cases, two people in the relationship were willing for God to work on their hearts and on the relationship and bring that relationship back together. And it takes two. I want to say that up front, because I think sometimes when people hear that we're talking about reconciling marriages, that happens in every instance. It doesn't. When you have somebody who's determined to go, they're going to go. And those that endeavor to stay or to work it out or to give God space to do that, sometimes God can really work a miracle. And for both of you, he has. So I wanted to ask you, what advice can you give to those whose marriages are hanging on by a thread right now? And, you know, there may be one or both people hoping for a miracle and not knowing what that looks like. What does it look like when that works out? And then Brandy and I are going to talk about when it doesn't. Danielle.
So yeah, I kind of hinted toward Matt and I, and you can check out our full story just for the sake of time. It's posted on our Instagram accounts, but so we actually separated last year due to just things that got in the way of our marriage, and a desire to want to live in the space of our flesh and not in the spirit. And so, you know, we separated last year. It was very hard. I was definitely at the place where my heart was so hardened that I think if Jesus himself came to my bedroom and said, I'm going to restore your marriage, I may have not believed him. And so there was just so much pain and hurt that had built up on my side, and just a lot of hiding and insecurity that had built up on my husband's side, that we just couldn't even have a conversation. Like we were even in the space where we couldn't even have a conversation around restoring a marriage with the hope that it would actually take place. And so I moved out last year pretty rapidly. It was not a good scenario or situation. But so I moved out with my boys, and last year went on the endeavor of, I would say that it was the space of like being with my tribe that really helped in the fact that I was ready for divorce, because I was just so done and so hurt and so hardened. But I had such women of wisdom around me that were like, just give it a year. There's no rush to get divorced. Don't call it quits yet. Like, see what the Lord will do. And at the time, like, super honest moment, I was like, these ladies have no idea. But now I'm so grateful that they were bold enough to speak that truth to me, and bold enough to get my mind back into the right space of honoring God. Because that was what that's just the place they were trying to get me back into, is how can you walk this trial out where you're not negating your God, you're honoring him through this walk, and you're able to be a testimony and a story for who may come behind you. And that was really, really important for me, and they knew that about my heart, and so they had to speak past my feelings and get to my heart, which I was really grateful for. And so that's when the journey kind of started, of just healing on my side, healing from pains, hurts, allowing God to break through my hardened heart against my husband, and get me back into a loving space with him. Because I, like Danielle, I find my husband extremely attractive. But I was even in this space. My heart was so hard that I was even in this space. I couldn't even see the attractiveness of my husband anymore. Like, that's how far gone I was. You know, and then he was so removed because he felt like he couldn't fully represent himself because of all the pain and hurt that it just continued to stack onto our relationship, that he didn't even find me attractive anymore. And so we were just so in opposite places. And it just took healing on both of our sides. We both got into counseling. We took advantage of every workshop in class around freedom and becoming whole by yourself. That's really what this whole book that I referenced in part one, reclaiming, rebuilding your we by reclaiming your I, is all about. Like, how can I in my marriage represent my full self? And it be safe to do that, be naked and unashamed, like we've been just kind of labeling it through this conversation. And so we had to work to get to that space. My husband started pursuing me way before I wanted him to pursue me again, which I was really grateful for. He was like, just making it known I'm still interested. And I was like, pump the brakes. But he didn't pump the brakes, thankfully. He continued to ask every single week. That was another thing, was during our separation, we still met up every Tuesday night for dinner with our kids. I know that's so weird to do. It was so awkward. Like, we would literally just sit across the table, like our arms folded, just staring at each other, not even talking. It was the most uncomfortable thing ever. But as time went on, it started to break down and gave us a space of like, we know this is when we're going to meet, and we know this is when we can have conversations if we're ready. And so he asked me out at Chick-fil-A like 1,000 times, you guys, can't even tell you. And so we finally went back out on our first date in 6 months after we separated. And for me, it was just the fact that I could see that he was now walking in the space that I always knew God wanted him to walk into. His demeanor was different. And I think for me, it was the fact that everyone on the outside could see it as well. I had people coming to me and saying that they could see Matt was like in a completely different place and that he wasn't even the same person anymore. So that was very hopeful for me. So we just kind of started that journey back together. It took a lot of dating. It took a lot of hard conversations. It took facing what we just walked through, because like, even though we wanted to move past it, we couldn't move past it without having the conversation first. So like you're saying, we didn't want to bring up the old things and continue to stay in that space, but also there was things that happened that had to be resolved within that space. And then it's moving forward now with a fresh sense of like, that's not who you were. That's not who I am. God has healed us, and we're going to walk in the wholeness and healing God has given us. Doesn't mean we're going to do it perfect. We may stumble, we may fall. I may get triggered. He may get triggered, but now we know how to walk in those things together versus against each other. We walk in them for each other now. And just making sure that we're constantly I love what you said earlier, Leah. It's in the midst of conversation that you really learn. And I think that's like a huge thing for us, is surrounding ourselves with married couples that we look up to. Some of them are even our age, but they just have such beautiful marriages. So we have older ones and younger ones, and some that are the same age as us, and listening to how they talk to their spouse, listening to how those conversations go, and having open and transparent conversations within all of that has been probably our biggest lesson in seeing how we want to grow, and also giving each other permission to fail, but also giving each other permission to sharpen each other, and giving each other permission to cheer each other on. I think that when you live with someone constantly, you can constantly see all the bad, and you can camp in that space for so long that you forget to talk about the great things. So our role is, for every critique, we have to say 3 positive things to that person following that critique, because you can constantly get into a space of critiquing and forget to encourage and uplift and, shower your spouse with all those yummy things that you really mean.
I gotta take my mute off. That's like the 3-minute manager as a boss. You're supposed to wrap your critique or your feedback in 2 positives, so that people come in and leave that conversation feeling encouraged. So I appreciate you sharing that, Danielle. One of the things that I just have to share on your behalf is that what was powerful to me is that, first of all, the number of marriages I can think of where somebody moves out for a full year and that they reconcile and don't end up in a divorce court is such a small number. It's such a small percentage. And I think there's space for God to do that in a lot of marriages. And it's because you determined from the beginning, you weren't making a decision. You had to move out because there needed to be change. Like sometimes you can get stuck in a place and somebody needs to make a big move. It doesn't have to be a permanent move, but you have to make a big move because you're stuck somewhere, right? And to get unstuck, somebody's got to get out of that rut or climb out of that ditch. And you did that. But you sat in such beautiful, surrendered silence. Oh, I'm going to cry, for a whole year. And you didn't You didn't go file for divorce. You waited for God to be God, and you let him do what only he could do in that situation, and because only the Holy Spirit could have done in Matt and in you what he did in that year of time. And I just want you to know I'm so proud of you, because so few people have the courage to just wait. I know I didn't. I hit the road out of a marriage, and I look at what you and Matt have walked through, and I don't regret where I live now. But I think, had I done that, given a year, even moved out and just given some space to breathe and just some things to change and to sift and to move, and for earth, for ground to unharden and to unpack, and all the things that can happen in a year, I don't even know what would have happened if I'd been able to do that and were walking with the Lord at that time. So I just want you to know that you're a beautiful example of something that's very rare. And I hope you tell your story a lot, because there's a lot of people who need to know that that can happen when you just give God time to breathe in those open spaces that you've created for him. So thank you on behalf of everyone I know that struggles with a marriage, that you've done that. We have about 10 more minutes left. And so Melissa, can you share quickly your insights on that same subject, and then we'll wrap up and talk just a little bit about kingdom and what it means, why marriage is important at the kingdom table. So
Sure. Like Danielle, I found my marriage hanging by a thread, but our journeys were a little bit different. After I had to make the decision whether I was going to stay or go, and I spent 3 days alone with just me and God, and I prayed literally in every room of our home, looking for the answer of what to do. And on the third day, I remember the very moment that the Lord spoke to me and said, "Stay." And to me, that was a promise that He knew that it was going to be okay. And so, we stayed together, but we almost had a parallel journey of healing. And so I needed to heal from the things that had taken place. He needed to heal and come back to the Lord. And I'm so thankful that Danielle was not going to Celebration at the time, that she was going to another church, because she led him to the church she was going to that had a phenomenal men's group. And so he dedicated a year and a half to meeting with those men every Monday night, and they walked him through healing and teaching him how to be the husband that God wanted him to be. And at the same time, Aaliyah, you led Breaking Free with 45 women, and it is not ironic that I landed in your group, and you helped me walk through that journey, and telling me sometimes some hard things. But we chose to stay in the home together because we felt it was important, while we were healing separately, that we needed to heal together. And in that journey, we realized it wasn't the current events that broke our marriage. Our marriage had been broken for 15 years. We brought a lot of brokenness and a lot of generational curses into our home, and we needed to work through that together. And so in the practical, we spent probably 5 nights on our back patio for about a year, talking through all the things that were broken and how do we get to a place of healing. And we spent time at Starbucks. It became our place. People came to meet us because they knew what we were going through and celebrated that with us. And so we were just committed to staying together. And also I'm been together with him for so long, but I'm still learning to become the wife that God wants me to be. So I'm walking through a study that Holly Furtick is leading called Becoming Mrs. Better Half. I think that's what it's called. And it's just learning to be the wife that's pleasing to the Lord, and focusing, and it's not a marriage study. It's a study about me and how can I be a better wife. And so I'm thankful that all of you were a part of that journey and loved us through all of that.
thank you so much for sharing that. And Brandy, I think we will schedule another time to dive in on the divorce issue, because I think that actually could be an entire episode of its own. But I will say on behalf of both of us that we recognize that not every marriage struggle ends the way Danielle's and Melissa's has. And I would encourage anyone, if you're in a relationship of abuse, if you're not safe, emotionally, physically, you need to get out somewhere where you can be safe. Again, give God time and space to speak to you, and be faithful to whatever he tells you to do. I know it's his heart. God's heart is always for reconciliation where we can. It's always about reconciling us in relationships and reconciling us back to the table. But it takes two very willing, or at least somewhat willing and stubbornly dragged sometimes people through change in order to get to the place that Danielle and Melissa have. It took their husbands and them both being willing to do that. And I just want to acknowledge for anyone that's watching this that, if you're hoping for that and you're not seeing it, and there might be resentment there to say, well, gosh, that doesn't work out for everybody. That didn't happen for me. We fully acknowledge that. And there's grace in the kingdom for all of that. And God has provision and plan for you no matter how that works out. You personally get to the table with God, focus on your relationship with him, give that person over to God, to your spouse, and let God do what he needs to do. And we just want to acknowledge everyone's journey and to validate everyone's journey here, because we don't want anyone to feel like we are passing any judgment on marriages that don't, work out the way Danielle's and Melissa's have. We hope that for everyone, but that doesn't always happen. So I want to close this out and land on probably the most important, powerful place for us, which is why marriage to begin with. Why why did God ordain that this would be a critical part of the human journey and a critical part of modeling his kingdom? And so I'm going to ask everybody to close out one at a time, and I'll call on you one at a time to really talk about that. Why do you think it's important to God? What does it model for humanity? And why is it an important value and an institution and a sacrament? Some, depending on your background, would call it. It's something sacred. But what makes it sacred, and why is that important to God? And I'll close this at the end. But Christina, if you could kick us off with your thoughts on that, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Leah. So, marriage being a covenant between one man, one woman, I believe that in that we're modeling what God did through Jesus and that covenant that we were given through the blood of Jesus. And so, we constantly work to model the kingdom love in a marriage and create children and expand humanity. And in that, we're impacting the world around us and showing them what kingdom love is and what the covenant that God gave us, what that is.
Beautiful. Danielle?
Well, for me, I think it's such a model of forgiveness. I think that is probably the thing that has made my marriage survive. Two people that are constantly rooted in loving each other, the core of each other, who we are, and just staying centered around that is ultimately is God. The most important thing for us is the Lord, and he's the cornerstone, right? And just like I was saying before, forgiveness. I think that it's such a model of forgiveness over and over and over again. Both of you constantly forgiving each other. I think it models forgiveness for my children. I think it models forgiveness for whoever's in my life, whoever gets to see my marriage. I'm always very transparent about how hard it is, and just how often it takes me laying myself down, which is really, what the Lord asks us to do, pick up our cross, lay ourselves down. And marriage is a tangible way that I have to apply that every single day. Sometimes it's laying down my opinion about things. Sometimes it's choosing happy over right. Sometimes it's, making sure I go out of my way to let him know that I respect him. Just, whatever that looks like in a practical way, but just constantly being love, the main thing, the most important thing, always putting love first, and always staying in prayer too. Sometimes I think I'm married so that I stay yoked to the Lord and stay in prayer.
Yes. Yeah.
So.
Thank you. Danielle?
I'm one who's done it we lived together before we were married, and then we separated again there just because I got saved and was like, oh, we're not doing this right. And then we got married and moved back in together. We just stayed in separate rooms because we had a baby. So, we still live together. But I'll say this, for me personally, I've done it outside of God's will and I've done it inside of God's will. And I will say that where I've seen blessing and favor and have had tremendous happiness is when I'm walking with what God has asked us to walk in. I don't know if I have like a deep theological answer for why it should be. I'm counting on Lee to come in with that. So I'm just going to come in with the experience of walking with God. I've never been disappointed, and walking in his ways, I've never felt disappointed. And so the more I can lean toward what he calls us to do, and the more I can look like Jesus in the scape of my marriage and living with God and in that covenant with my husband, I just think, hey, that's what I'm going to do. Don't cause more pain to myself than necessary.
Exactly. Melissa.
God is the architect of marriage, and we were created in his image to mirror him. And marriage should reflect God's image and to a world that desperately needs him. And I'm so thankful for our journey and how he can redeem all of our mess for his glory. And when we walk through all of our things, people were coming out in just droves and just connecting with us and wanting us to help walk through them through what they were going through. And so we can be Jesus to a world that needs him through our marriage.
Brandy.
Yeah, I would echo what every woman has said here, but I for our house, for the depth and my story and struggle, I think the biggest thing is that it is what happens at the kingdom table in marriage is a representative of what happens between our Lord and the body and his bride. And it's not always, we all know as Christians, it's not an easy journey. It is a beautiful journey. It can be a heartbreaking journey. It can be a breathtaking journey, but it is not always an easy journey. And it requires constant reevaluation and recentering and healing and freedom and all of these things that we've all talked about through every topic. And I think that when a marriage between two kingdom-minded people conquers those things the way everybody has talked about their marriages conquering those things, I think that what happens is a ripple effect that we can't contain. It becomes this game changer, and it breaks generational curses, and it witnesses to people, and it becomes the visibility of Jesus in the world around us, in a world where more than half of marriages are ending in divorce, where it's so easy to walk away and point a finger, where it's harder to fight toe to toe, where it's harder to talk about intimacy in a different framework. And there's something so very powerful about that when we come to the table and realize that, God didn't have to make a place at the table for us. He didn't have to set a chair out for me with all my brokenness and my mess and my garbage and all of the junk, my rebellion and my defiance and my pride. He didn't have to, but he did. And it is the most beautiful picture to me of marriage. I don't have to. There's nothing compelling me to give my husband a place at my side, to walk with me, to be my partner and my best friend and my lover and my cheerleader. But when I do, and I make that space, there is nothing more powerful, not for my children, not for my friends, not for my church, my local body, and not for the kingdom. And I think that's it. I mean, that's what it comes down to for me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was so powerful and so beautiful. I know, mic dropper right there. But Christina, you used a word earlier that I want to close us on, and it's covenant. I think the most powerful thing about marriage, what sets it apart from any other relationship we have, even the one we have with our kids, is that it's contractual. There is a covenant relationship that we enter into with our spouses. And covenants are so critical to God. They are promises made and vows that are made. And when God entered into covenants all throughout the Word of God, all throughout the Old Testament, he was making promises that he kept for humanity. And so it was his way of saying this kind of covenant relationship where you contractually obligate yourself and yoke yourself to another person, and you're willing to take up that cross every day to do the hard stuff, to work it out, to push for healing, to fight for each other, to lean in and look and see and understand each other, and get to a place where your love is agape love. It's not just erotic love, and it's not just feel good love. It's true agape love. That is when you model my kingdom the most. And that's what the world needs to see. And it's also through that we're able to be fruitful and multiply. It's how God is, it's by his design that he's going to build kingdom in the earth through marriages and through families. And so because it was important to him, it has to be important to us. And so I know that that's a difficult concept for people to, I think for even believers to wrap their minds and hearts around. For those that are still struggling in their walk or belief in God, that can be even more difficult. But I would just say as we close that meditating on covenant is a powerful part of that, and understanding. And I don't even remember what movie it was, but I remember there was a movie I watched where it was a romance, and the man said to the woman, "Why do we need to get married? We're already committed to each other." And she said, "Well, I would like to know that you're legally required to be here." And so there was something powerful in that statement. It was a joke in the movie, but I'm like, she's talking about covenant. She's talking about the fact that we've made a vow and a compact and agreement. We don't do that with anybody else. We do it in business, but we don't do it. We don't make covenants with our kids. We don't sign contracts. We don't do that with friendships. And thus, we're free to come and go in those to some degree. And marriage is something where we say we're in it no matter how hard it gets. So I think that's what sets it apart. I also think it's what makes it so hard, and it's what makes it mirror and reflect Jesus more than anything else on the earth. It's also why it's the primary target of the enemy, marriage and family and children, because he knows that this is a reflection of heaven to earth. When we get it right, Brandy, when it's beautiful and there's two kingdom centered, kingdom committed people doing it, the sky's the limit, not only on your marriage, but on how it reflects kingdom to the earth. And so I just want to thank each of you for being here. I know we've had a few hours together over the course of these recordings. Thank you for sharing your heart, your relationships. Please thank your husbands for allowing you to share your stories and your hearts, because I'm believing that there's somebody, maybe more than one somebody out there, who's going to watch these videos and who's going to be encouraged and inspired, maybe to go a little longer, to get in a group, to find a tribe of women to connect with, to change maybe the way they think or view their expectations, to find good resources like Danielle and Danielle have suggested. Get out there and resource yourself. It's that important. Don't do it alone. Don't do it in isolation. Find people that you can talk to, and if you need counseling, if you need resourcing, find it. I want to pray us out. Thank you all for being here. And I just want to pray over you and over those that are watching. Lord, we love you. We thank you, God, for this time together. We thank you that you've given us an opportunity to open the books of our lives and talk about something that's so critically important to you, that's sacred and holy. And yet it's the thing we have a really hard time getting right down here, Lord. So I thank you for your patience and your grace with us, that your love is unconditional, that your mercies are new every morning, that your love for us is boundless, that you've walked in human skin, so you know how hard this is. And Lord, I thank you that you put people in our midst so that we don't do this alone, so that we walk strengthened arm to arm to figure this out. Lord, I pray for every marriage represented on this screen, and every marriage of the people who are watching or will watch this. God, I pray that you would be real to them, that you would show yourself, that they would see you and feel you and know you at the center of their union, God, and that as you draw each heart to you, that becomes a tighter bond. A three-vessel cord is not easily broken. God, I pray that you would knit together three-vessel cords in the marriages in our midst, that they would be strong with you at the center, that grace would abound, and that love would define them above all. We thank you, God, that you love us and that you designed this for us, and it reflects your kingdom. We thank you for our place at your table, and we give you all the glory in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, guys. Thank you to our viewers for being with us, and we hope you'll follow more episodes to come. Thanks.